The afternoon sun cast gentle shadows across the vicarage garden in St. Mary Mead, where the monthly parish tea had drawn its usual collection of villagers for cucumber sandwiches and quiet gossip. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath the old apple tree, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a soft blue jumper for her great-nephew. To any casual observer, she appeared entirely absorbed in her stitches, but her keen eyes missed nothing of the social tableau unfolding around her. Mrs. Dolly Bantry held court near the tea-urn, resplendent in her new lavender dress, regaling the vicar's wife with tales of her prize-winning roses. Colonel Weatherby stood stiffly by the cake table, consulting his pocket watch with military precision, while young Dr. Haydock chatted amiably with Miss Hartnell about the unusually dry September weather. The familiar rhythm of village life hummed along pleasantly, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter from the children playing croquet on the lawn. It was precisely the sort of peaceful gathering that Arthur Finch, the village postman, never missed. For 15 years, he had completed his afternoon rounds with clockwork regularity, arriving at the vicarage garden at exactly 4 o'clock to enjoy Mrs. Clement's famous Victoria sponge and share the day's postal gossip. The villagers could set their watches by his appearance, bicycle bell chiming cheerfully as he rounded the corner from Church Lane. Miss Marple glanced up from her knitting as the church clock chimed 4, then 1:15. The conversation continued to flow around her, but she noticed Mrs. Clement's increasingly frequent glances toward the gate. By 4:30, even Colonel Weatherby was frowning, his military sense of punctuality clearly disturbed by Arthur's unprecedented tardiness. "I do hope Arthur hasn't had trouble with his bicycle," Mrs. Clement murmured to no one in particular, her voice carrying a note of genuine concern. "He's never been late before. Not once in all these years." Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment. Arthur Finch was indeed a creature of habit, as reliable as the dawn. She had observed him for years, noting his methodical nature, his pride in his work, and his genuine affection for the villagers on his route. He was not a man to simply disappear without explanation. Dr. Haydock, ever practical, suggested that perhaps Arthur had encountered an emergency call or a registered letter requiring extra attention. But even as he spoke, his tone lacked conviction. Mrs. Bantry, never one to let a potential drama pass unnoticed, declared that someone should walk down Church Lane to investigate. Miss Marple quietly folded her knitting and rose from her chair. "Perhaps I might take a little stroll," she suggested mildly. "The evening air would do me good, and I could look in on Arthur's route." A small group formed naturally around her suggestion. Colonel Weatherby, his sense of duty engaged, insisted on accompanying her. Mrs. Bantry, her curiosity thoroughly aroused, gathered her shawl with theatrical flair. Even young Timothy Pierce, the butcher's son, abandoned his game to join the impromptu search party. They walked down Church Lane in the golden afternoon light, past the neat cottage garden still bright with late summer flowers. Miss Marple moved slowly, her sharp eyes taking in details that her companions overlooked entirely. She noticed that the morning post had been delivered to every house along the route, letters tucked neatly through brass slots and wooden boxes. Whatever had befallen Arthur had occurred after he had completed his regular deliveries. Near the old stone bridge that crossed Meadow Brook, they found his bicycle. It lay on its side in the tall grass beside the path, the front wheel still spinning lazily in the gentle breeze. The red Royal Mail bag was nowhere to be seen, but Arthur's thermos flask lay nearby, its contents spilled and seeping into the dark earth. Colonel Weatherby immediately took charge, barking orders about preserving the scene while Mrs. Bantry hurried back to telephone the police. But Miss Marple stood quietly beside the abandoned bicycle, her head tilted slightly as if listening to something only she could hear. The late afternoon shadows were lengthening now, and somewhere in the distance, the church bell chimed 5 o'clock. In St. Mary Mead, Arthur Finch should have been settling into his favorite chair at the vicarage, recounting the day's small adventures over tea and cake. Instead, he had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and the lingering scent of spilled tea. Miss Marple bent down to examine the bicycle more closely. The chain was intact, the tires properly inflated. There was no sign of mechanical failure or accident. But there, caught on the brake cable, was a small piece of blue fabric, so tiny it might easily have been overlooked. She carefully extracted it with her knitting needle, noting its fine quality and unusual shade. As the search party reassembled and voices rose in speculation about accidents and emergencies, Miss Marple remained silent. She had learned long ago that the most important clues were often the smallest ones, the details that others dismissed as insignificant. Arthur Finch had not simply vanished. Someone had ensured his disappearance, and in doing so, had disturbed the peaceful rhythm of St. Mary Mead in ways they could not yet imagine. The postman, who had never been late, was now missing entirely, and with him, the village's comfortable certainties had begun to unravel. The news of Arthur's disappearance spread through St. Mary Mead with the peculiar velocity that only genuine mystery could achieve. By the time Inspector Slack arrived from Much Benham, half the village had assembled near the bridge, their faces bearing that particular expression of concern mixed with barely concealed excitement that accompanies any disruption to rural tranquility. Inspector Slack emerged from his motor car with the air of a man who had seen quite enough of village dramatics for one lifetime. He was a compact, efficient sort of person, with sharp eyes that seemed to categorize everything they encountered into neat, manageable compartments. After a brief consultation with Constable Pritchard, who had remained dutifully stationed beside the abandoned bicycle, Slack surveyed the scene with professional skepticism. "Right then," he announced to the assembled crowd. "Nothing to see here that won't keep until morning. Best you all return to your homes and let us get on with proper police work." But Miss Marple, who had remained quietly in the background during the initial commotion, found herself studying the inspector's confident demeanor with interest. She had observed enough of human nature to recognize when someone was perhaps too eager to reach conclusions, and Inspector Slack's rapid assessment of the situation struck her as premature. The small piece of blue fabric remained safely tucked in her knitting bag, a detail she felt might be better preserved for the moment. Experience had taught her that evidence shared too quickly often became evidence dismissed too readily, particularly by officials who preferred their mysteries to fit into familiar patterns. As the crowd began to disperse, the theories began to multiply. Mrs. Bantry, never one to let a dramatic moment pass without proper embellishment, had already constructed an elaborate narrative involving highway robbery and desperate criminals. "Mark my words," she declared to anyone within earshot, "this is the work of those dreadful motor bandits one reads about in the newspapers. Poor Arthur, caught quite unawares while going about his honest duties." Colonel Weatherby, however, favored a more methodical approach. "Nonsense, Dolly. Arthur's bicycle shows no signs of struggle. If bandits were involved, there would be evidence of violence. This has all the hallmarks of something far more calculated." His military background had trained him to look for tactical elements that others might miss, though Miss Marple noted that his theories, while logical, still assumed facts not yet in evidence. Dr. Haydock offered the most sobering possibility. "We mustn't overlook the simplest explanation. Arthur's been under considerable strain lately, what with his mother's illness and the extra duties at the sorting office. Perhaps he simply wandered off. These things happen more often than we care to admit." But it was young Mrs. Fletcher who provided the most intriguing piece of information, though she seemed reluctant to volunteer it. Miss Marple had noticed the pale, anxious woman lingering at the edge of the crowd, her hands twisting nervously at her gloves. When approached gently, Mrs. Fletcher revealed that Arthur had been expected at Rose Cottage that very afternoon. "He was to deliver a registered letter," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something quite important from my solicitor in London. Arthur had mentioned it specifically yesterday, saying he would ensure it reached me personally." Her eyes darted nervously between Miss Marple and Inspector Slack. "I do hope his disappearance hasn't... that is, I hope the letter hasn't gone astray." Inspector Slack made a note of this information with the air of a man checking items off a list. "Registered post, you say? Well, that explains the missing bag. Robbery, most likely. These letters often contain valuable items or information worth stealing." Miss Marple found herself wondering about the nature of Mrs. Fletcher's correspondence. The young woman had arrived in St. Mary Mead only a month prior, renting Rose Cottage with the quiet efficiency of someone who preferred to avoid attention. Yet here was evidence of ongoing legal matters significant enough to require registered delivery. It was, as Miss Marple often observed, the small inconsistencies in people's stories that proved most illuminating. As evening settled over the village, Inspector Slack established his temporary headquarters at the Blue Boar, confident that morning would bring either Arthur's sheepish return or clear evidence of the criminal activity he suspected. The villagers, meanwhile, retreated to their homes with the peculiar mixture of unease and anticipation that accompanies any break in routine. Miss Marple walked slowly back to her cottage, her mind arranging the day's observations like pieces of a complex puzzle. Arthur Finch was not a man given to dramatic gestures or sudden departures. His disappearance, she felt certain, was connected to something specific, perhaps the very registered letter that Mrs. Fletcher awaited so anxiously. The blue fabric fragment weighed almost nothing in her knitting bag, yet Miss Marple sensed it might prove to be the most significant clue of all. Its fine quality and unusual shade suggested it came from an expensive garment, not the sort of thing one would expect to find caught on a postman's bicycle by accident. Someone wearing such fabric had been present when Arthur disappeared, and that someone had been close enough to leave behind this telltale evidence. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple reflected on the day's events with the systematic thoroughness that had served her well in previous mysteries. Tomorrow would bring new developments, she felt certain. In her experience, whoever had orchestrated Arthur's disappearance would not be content to let matters rest. The very act of making a reliable man unreliable created ripples that would inevitably disturb other carefully laid plans. The village of St. Mary Mead settled into an uneasy sleep, while somewhere in the darkness, the truth about Arthur Finch's fate waited to be discovered by those patient enough to look beyond the obvious and wise enough to trust that human nature, in all its complexity, would eventually reveal itself. The morning brought with it an unusual stillness to St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple rose with her customary early hour, but instead of her usual contemplative garden tending, she found herself drawn to her kitchen window, observing the subtle changes in her neighbor's routines that only a practiced eye would notice. Mrs. Bantry's curtains remained drawn well past their usual opening time, while Colonel Weatherby could be seen pacing his garden path with the restless energy of a man accustomed to action, but forced into waiting. The post office on High Street provided her first destination, where Mrs. Emmeline Rudge had opened for business with the determined air of someone maintaining normalcy against considerable odds. The small shop carried an atmosphere of disruption beneath its orderly surface, and Mrs. Rudge herself appeared to have aged several years overnight. "Such a terrible business, Miss Marple," Mrs. Rudge confided as she sorted the morning's delivery with hands that trembled slightly. 15 years Arthur's worked this route, and never so much as a late delivery. The ledger tells the whole story, if you'd care to see. Miss Marple accepted the invitation with gentle interest, noting that Arthur had collected 3 registered items yesterday afternoon. The careful entries, written in his neat hand, showed deliveries intended for Mrs. Fletcher at Rose Cottage, a Mr. Lionel Drake staying at the Blue Boar, and Colonel Weatherby at Wayside House. Each entry was time-stamped with Arthur's characteristic precision, the last notation reading, "Collected 3:30 p.m. for afternoon delivery." He was particularly careful about the timing, Mrs. Rudge explained. Mrs. Fletcher had specifically requested that her letter arrive before 4 o'clock, and Arthur took such requests seriously. He planned to visit Rose Cottage first, then the Colonel's house on his way to the vicarage tea. Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. The sequence suggested that Arthur's disappearance had occurred early in his delivery route, which raised intriguing questions about timing and opportunity. If someone had been waiting for him, they would have needed to know his precise schedule. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Constable Pritchard, who brought news that shifted the investigation's focus considerably. The post bag had been discovered at dawn, snagged on the roots of an old willow where Meadow Brook curved past Miller's Field. The ordinary mail remained intact, though water-damaged, but the leather pouch containing the registered items had been cut away with what appeared to be a sharp knife. Very deliberate it was, Constable Pritchard reported to Mrs. Rudge, though his voice carried clearly to Miss Marple's attentive ears. Someone knew exactly what they were after. Inspector Slacks convinced it's robbery, pure and simple. Miss Marple found herself wondering about the precision of such theft. In her experience, criminals who operated with such surgical accuracy rarely left bicycles abandoned in obvious locations or allowed postbags to be found so readily. The entire sequence suggested either remarkable carelessness or deliberate misdirection. Her walk to Rose Cottage revealed Mrs. Fletcher in her garden, but the young woman's usual methodical approach to her roses had given way to agitated, almost frantic activity. She was dead-heading flowers with unnecessary force, her movements sharp and disconnected. When Miss Marple approached the garden gate, Mrs. Fletcher started violently, dropping her secateurs with a metallic clatter. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't hear you approaching." Mrs. Fletcher's voice carried a breathless quality that suggested her nerves were stretched considerably thinner than the previous evening. "I've been trying to keep busy, you understand. Waiting is so dreadful when one doesn't know what's happened." Miss Marple offered gentle sympathy while observing that Mrs. Fletcher's distress seemed to contain elements beyond simple concern for Arthur's welfare. There was something almost guilty in the way she avoided direct eye contact, and her hands showed the telltale tremor of someone under considerable strain. "The registered letter you were expecting," Miss Marple ventured carefully. "I do hope it wasn't anything that required immediate attention." Mrs. Fletcher's reaction was immediate and telling. Her face flushed, then paled, and she pressed her lips together as if preventing words from escaping. "It was family business. Legal matters that have been dragging on since my husband's death. My brother-in-law has been rather difficult about the settlement, and yesterday's delivery was to have resolved everything finally." The admission seemed to cost her considerable effort, and Miss Marple noted the careful way she phrased her explanation. Family disputes over money possessed a particular capacity for generating desperate actions, and the timing of Arthur's disappearance in relation to this crucial delivery seemed far from coincidental. Dr. Haydock's arrival at Rose Cottage interrupted their conversation, his professional bag in hand and concern evident in his manner. "Mrs. Fletcher, I wanted to check on you after last evening. You seemed quite overwrought, and I prescribed something to help you sleep." Mrs. Fletcher accepted his attention gratefully, though Miss Marple observed that her distress appeared to have different qualities now than it had the previous evening. Yesterday's anxiety had seemed focused on Arthur's welfare. Today's nervousness suggested more personal concerns. As Dr. Haydock completed his brief examination, Miss Marple found herself considering the various threads that were beginning to emerge. The missing registered pouch, Mrs. Fletcher's legal troubles, the precise timing of Arthur's disappearance, and the almost theatrical nature of the evidence left behind all suggested a complexity that Inspector Slack's robbery theory failed to address adequately. The small piece of blue fabric remained safely tucked in her knitting bag, a tangible reminder that someone wearing expensive clothing had been present at Arthur's bicycle when he disappeared. Combined with the growing evidence of careful planning rather than opportunistic crime, Miss Marple began to suspect that Arthur Finch's fate was intimately connected to secrets that ran much deeper than simple postal theft. As Dr. Haydock's footsteps faded down the garden path, Miss Marple remained at Rose Cottage's gate, her practiced eye noting that Mrs. Fletcher's distress seemed to contain layers beyond simple concern for Arthur's welfare. The young woman's hands trembled as she gathered the scattered secateurs, and her glances toward the cottage windows suggested someone expecting unwelcome visitors rather than merely awaiting news. Inspector Slack's arrival from the direction of the Blue Boar interrupted these observations. He approached with the brisk efficiency of a man who believed his investigation was proceeding according to plan, his notebook already opened to a fresh page. "Mrs. Fletcher, I need to discuss the registered correspondence you were expecting. The contents may help us understand what motivated yesterday's theft." Mrs. Fletcher's response came with careful hesitation. "Family legal matters, Inspector. Documents concerning my late husband's estate settlement. The value would be more personal than financial." Her choice of words struck Miss Marple as deliberately vague, the sort of careful phrasing that concealed as much as it revealed. Constable Pritchard's arrival brought news that shifted the investigation's focus considerably. "We've found footprints by the willow, sir. 2 distinct sets. Arthur's boots, which we recovered, and another set entirely. Small feet, narrow, wearing expensive leather shoes with pointed toes. Not what you'd expect from common thieves." Inspector Slack frowned at this complication to his robbery theory, but Miss Marple found the evidence illuminating. Expensive footwear suggested someone from the village's respectable circles, rather than roving criminals. Someone Arthur would have approached without suspicion. Her contemplation was interrupted by the appearance of a stranger walking purposefully down Church Lane. The man was tall, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, with sharp features that suggested both intelligence and calculation. He approached the group with the confidence of someone accustomed to taking charge of situations. "Inspector Slack, I presume. I'm Philip Desmond, Mrs. Fletcher's brother-in-law. I drove down from London immediately upon hearing this disturbing news." His voice carried cultured tones with an underlying edge of impatience. "I understand there's been some difficulty regarding registered correspondence." Mrs. Fletcher's face paled visibly at his appearance, and she retreated toward her cottage door with obvious discomfort. "Philip, I didn't expect you so soon." "Naturally, I came at once, Eleanor. Family obligations, you understand." His smile didn't reach his eyes as he turned back to Inspector Slack. "I should mention that Mrs. Fletcher and I have been involved in ongoing legal proceedings regarding my late brother's estate. Yesterday's correspondence likely contained an unfavorable judgment against my interests." Inspector Slack's expression brightened considerably. Here was a suspect with clear motive, means, and opportunity. "And where were you yesterday afternoon, Mr. Desmond?" "In London, conducting business. I have witnesses, naturally." Desmond's response came smoothly, perhaps too smoothly. "However, I should point out that resorting to violence against postal workers would be both unnecessary and counterproductive. I'm a businessman, Inspector, not a common criminal." The news of Desmond's arrival and admitted motive spread through St. Mary Mead with remarkable speed. By afternoon, the village had found its preferred villain, an outsider with clear financial motivation. Mrs. Bantry, emerging from Gossington Hall with the satisfied expression of someone whose theories had been vindicated, pronounced herself unsurprised by these developments. "I knew there was something unsavory about that family situation," she declared to Miss Marple. "Inheritance disputes bring out the worst in people. Poor Eleanor has been under tremendous strain, though she's tried to hide it." But Miss Marple found herself studying the situation with growing unease. The solution felt too convenient, too neatly packaged. Her experience had taught her that human nature rarely arranged itself into such obvious patterns, and the physical evidence suggested complexities that a simple inheritance dispute couldn't adequately explain. Later that afternoon, she encountered Mr. Lionel Drake from the Blue Boar walking along High Street. His cornflower blue suit caught the sunlight, and Miss Marple noted its fine quality and precise tailoring. As they exchanged pleasantries, she observed a small pulled thread near his sleeve, barely visible but consistent with fabric caught on something metallic. "Such lovely weather we've been having," she remarked gently, "though one must be careful of brambles and bicycle parts when walking the country lanes. They do catch at one's clothing so unexpectedly." Drake's hand moved unconsciously toward the damaged area of his sleeve. "Indeed, Miss Marple. Old bicycles can be particularly troublesome. One must watch where one steps." His smile remained pleasant, but his eyes had grown cautious. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her cottage garden, her knitting needles moving rhythmically as she considered the day's revelations. The blue fabric fragment in her bag seemed to whisper possibilities that grew more intriguing with each new development. Philip Desmond provided a convenient explanation for Arthur's disappearance, complete with motive and opportunity. Yet the physical evidence pointed towards someone else entirely, someone who wore expensive clothing and moved through the village with easy familiarity. The expensive footprints by the willow, the carefully cut post bag, the theatrical arrangement of evidence all suggested a mind that understood both the village's rhythms and its residents' psychology. Someone had orchestrated Arthur's disappearance with considerable skill, using the inheritance dispute as convenient misdirection while pursuing goals that remained hidden beneath layers of respectability and careful planning. Miss Marple reflected that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most trustworthy, who understood that the best place to hide was in plain sight among friends and neighbors who would never suspect them of harboring dark intentions. The morning brought a crystalline clarity to St. Mary Mead, the sort of light that seemed to illuminate not just the physical world, but the subtle undercurrents of human behavior that Miss Marple had spent a lifetime learning to read. She rose with her customary early hour, but instead of her usual garden contemplation, she found herself drawn to a more systematic exploration of the questions that had troubled her sleep. Her first destination was the Blue Boar, where she arrived under the perfectly reasonable pretext of inquiring about Mrs. Dollop's famous seed cake recipe. The timing was fortuitous, placing her in the inn's small lobby just as Mr. Lionel Drake descended the stairs, impeccably dressed in a fresh suit of charcoal gray. His appearance was, as always, beyond reproach, but Miss Marple's trained eye immediately noted the absence of the cornflower blue suit from the previous day. "Good morning, Mr. Drake," she offered, with her characteristic gentle warmth. "How pleasant to see you looking so well pressed despite our country air. I do hope the damp hasn't troubled your wardrobe. These old buildings can be quite trying for fine fabrics." His smile came readily, though she detected a slight tightness around his eyes. "Most considerate of you to ask, Miss Marple. Fortunately, Mrs. Dollop's establishment provides excellent pressing services. One must maintain standards, even in rustic surroundings." Mrs. Dollop herself bustled into the conversation with the cheerful efficiency of someone who took pride in her services. "Oh yes, Mr. Drake sent his blue suit down first thing this morning. Caught it on something yesterday," he said. "Dreadful nuisance. Country brambles." Mabel's worked wonders with the mending, though I'm afraid the stain on the shoes required special attention. Miss Marple's needles seemed to pause in their rhythm, though her expression remained serenely interested. How fortunate that Mabel is so skilled. Grass stains can be particularly stubborn, especially from the areas near water. Drake's response came perhaps a fraction too quickly. Indeed, one must be careful when exploring the scenic walks. The path by Meadowbrook is particularly treacherous for the unwary. After securing the seed cake recipe she didn't particularly need, Miss Marple made her way to Arthur's cottage, where his elderly mother received her with the grateful warmth reserved for those who remember to visit in times of trouble. Mrs. Finch, despite her worry, possessed the sharp memory of someone who had spent decades observing the rhythms of village life. "Arthur was particular about his route yesterday," she confided over tea. "Said he had 3 special deliveries to make and timing was crucial. The pretty widow at Rose Cottage needed her papers before 4, the colonel liked his correspondence prompt, and the gentleman at the inn had been asking specific questions about delivery schedules. Miss Marple's attention sharpened. "Asking questions, you say?" "Oh yes, dear. Arthur mentioned it twice. The gentleman wanted to know exactly when registered post arrived, whether Arthur followed the same route daily, and whether he might be available for a special arrangement. Arthur was flattered by the attention, poor lamb. He always took pride in his reliability." The pieces were beginning to form a pattern in Miss Marple's mind, though she kept her growing suspicions carefully hidden behind her gentle demeanor. Her next stop was Colonel Weatherby's residence, where she found him in his study, surrounded by the military precision that governed his daily existence. "Dreadful business about Arthur," the colonel declared, his manner brisk but genuinely concerned. "Can't understand these modern criminals. In my day, a postman's bag was sacred territory." Miss Marple settled into the offered chair, her knitting emerging as if by magic. "Indeed, Colonel. Though I wonder if this was quite the random crime it appears. Arthur was so methodical about his deliveries. I understand you were expecting registered correspondence yourself." The colonel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Routine military pension documentation, nothing that would interest a common thief." His glance flickered toward the fireplace, where Miss Marple noticed the remnants of what appeared to be official papers, their blue government seals still partially visible among the ashes. Her afternoon was spent in careful observation at the Blue Boar's tea room, where she positioned herself with a clear view of the common areas while maintaining the appearance of someone simply enjoying a quiet cup and her knitting. When Mr. Drake appeared for his own refreshment, Miss Marple seized her moment with the calculated precision of a chess master executing a long-planned gambit. As he passed her table, she allowed her knitting bag to slip from her lap, its contents scattering across the floor in apparent clumsiness. "Oh dear, how terribly awkward of me," she murmured, beginning to gather her things with deliberate slowness. Drake immediately bent to assist, his natural courtesy overriding any caution. "Please, allow me, Miss Marple." As he collected the scattered balls of yarn, his fingers brushed against the small piece of blue fabric she had so carefully preserved. The contact lasted only seconds, but it was enough. The texture, the precise shade, the quality of the weave, all confirmed what she had begun to suspect. "How kind you are, Mr. Drake," she said, accepting his assistance with gracious warmth. "It's so reassuring when things are restored to their proper places, don't you think?" His agreement came smoothly, though she noted the slight tremor in his hands as he helped her reorganize her knitting supplies. More telling still was the nearly invisible scratch on his polished leather shoe, exactly the sort of mark that might result from contact with bicycle spokes or metal fixtures. As evening approached, Miss Marple walked slowly home, her mind arranging the day's observations with the methodical care of someone assembling a complex puzzle. The blue fabric fragment, so carefully preserved, had yielded its secret. Mr. Drake's expensive suit, his detailed knowledge of Arthur's route, his questions about delivery schedules, and now the physical evidence linking him to the scene of Arthur's disappearance, all pointed toward a truth far more complex than simple robbery. The village's focus on Philip Desmond and his inheritance dispute provided convenient misdirection, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most respectable, who understood that the best hiding place was in plain sight among friends and neighbors who would never suspect their true nature. The morning brought with it a peculiar clarity to Miss Marple's thoughts, the sort of mental crystallization that often preceded her most significant insights. She rose with her customary early hour, but instead of her usual garden contemplation, she found herself drawn to a more systematic approach to the questions that had troubled her sleep. The blue fabric fragment, now safely tucked in her jewelry box, had confirmed her suspicions about Mr. Drake's involvement, but the full scope of his deception remained tantalizingly out of reach. Her first destination was the post office, where Mrs. Rudge greeted her with the weary gratitude of someone who had spent a sleepless night worrying about Arthur's fate. The ledger lay open on the counter, its neat columns telling their own story of village routine disrupted. Miss Marple studied the registered entries once more, noting Arthur's careful annotations in the margins. Arthur was particularly conscientious about timing yesterday, Mrs. Rudge confided, her voice carrying the strain of recent events. He mentioned that Mr. Drake had inquired again about delivery schedules, even offered to meet Arthur along his route if the timing proved difficult. I told Arthur to be cautious of folks who ask too many questions about patterns. It's rarely for innocent reasons. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, Mrs. Rudge. And did Mr. Drake collect much correspondence himself? Mostly London letters on expensive paper, Mrs. Rudge replied. He claimed to be conducting business negotiations from the village. Very particular about timing he was. Asked whether registered items still used sealing wax as a rule, or if modern methods had replaced such old-fashioned practices. The mention of sealing wax sent a small thrill of recognition through Miss Marple, though she maintained her gentle demeanor. At the Blue Boar, she found Mabel, the industrious maid, polishing brass with characteristic energy. With the promise of her famous elderflower cordial recipe, Miss Marple encouraged the young woman to share details about her recent mending work. "Such a terrible job on Mr. Drake's blue suit, Miss Marple," Mabel confided, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A proper snag across the sleeve, like something sharp had caught it. Not a thorn, mind you, but more like wire or metal. And there was a smear on the cuff, red and crumbly. I recognized sealing wax immediately, having helped with the vicar's correspondence often enough." Miss Marple's pulse quickened, though her expression remained serenely interested. "How fortunate that you were able to restore it so skillfully." "His shoes required special attention too," Mabel continued proudly. "Greenish stains around the soles, and tiny scratches like he'd caught them in bicycle spokes. When I asked where he'd been to earn such rough treatment, he laughed and said he'd been getting acquainted with our brook. Seemed an odd place for shoes like that." Her next stop took her to Arthur's cottage, where his elderly mother received her with touching gratitude. Mrs. Finch possessed the sharp memory of someone who had spent decades observing village rhythms, and her recollections proved illuminating. Arthur mentioned Mr. Drake's particular interest in his route. Mrs. Finch revealed over tea. The gentleman had asked detailed questions about timing, whether Arthur followed the same path daily, and if special arrangements might be possible. Arthur was flattered by the attention, poor dear. He always took such pride in his reliability. Walking toward Meadowbrook, Miss Marple encountered young Timothy Pierce, who was perched on the stone bridge with a fishing line, though his attention seemed more focused on the surrounding landscape than on catching anything. Children, she had learned, often observed crucial details that adults overlooked entirely. "I saw someone here yesterday afternoon," Timothy volunteered with the solemnity that children reserve for important revelations. "A gentleman in a blue suit, standing with his foot on a bicycle wheel, like he wanted to stop it from turning. He told me kindly to run along to the vicarage or I'd miss the cake. He had a nice voice." Miss Marple settled beside him on the bridge wall. "What made his voice particularly nice, Timothy?" The boy considered this gravely. "It sounded like the wireless announcer during the evening news, smiling but not really laughing. Like when grown-ups are being polite but thinking about something else entirely." The observation struck Miss Marple as remarkably perceptive. She examined the area beneath the bridge more carefully, noting the scuff marks where something heavy might have been dragged, and the fine impressions in the soft earth that suggested expensive leather shoes. Near a tuft of sedge grass, she discovered a tiny fragment of scarlet sealing wax, which she carefully preserved in her handkerchief. Her afternoon visit to Colonel Weatherby revealed a man under considerable strain. His usually immaculate study showed signs of hasty document disposal, and the air carried the telltale scent of burned paper. The colonel admitted her with obvious reluctance, his military bearing somewhat diminished by anxiety. "I must confess, Miss Marple, that my earlier statement to Inspector Slack was not entirely accurate. he began stiffly. The registered letter Arthur was carrying for me contained not pension documentation, but rather an old service testimonial that could prove damaging to my reputation if misunderstood. A foolish business from 30 years ago, nothing criminal, but the sort of thing that modern publicity could twist into scandal. Miss Marple's expression softened with understanding. Arthur would never have judged you harshly, Colonel. Quite so. But others might not be so charitable. Mr. Drake, for instance, mentioned that he collected historical anecdotes for a book he was writing. When he inquired about my military service, I told him firmly to mind his own affairs. I fear I may have aroused his curiosity rather than dampening it. As evening approached, Miss Marple made her way slowly home, her mind arranging the day's discoveries with methodical precision. The physical evidence now painted a clear picture of Drake's involvement in Arthur's disappearance. The sealing wax fragments, the damaged suit, the witness testimony, and the suspicious timing all pointed toward a carefully orchestrated crime rather than random theft. Yet she sensed that the full truth contained layers of complexity that extended beyond simple robbery. Drake's detailed interest in the village's residents, his questions about historical matters, and his strategic positioning at the Blue Boar suggested someone pursuing multiple objectives simultaneously. The missing registered letters had provided convenient cover for his real purpose, but what that purpose might be remained tantalizingly unclear. Settling into her parlor with her knitting, Miss Marple reflected on the peculiar nature of criminals who believed their intelligence made them invisible. In her experience, such individuals often possessed genuine cleverness but lacked the wisdom to understand that true invisibility came not from superior planning, but from the ability to blend seamlessly into the fabric of ordinary life. Mr. Drake, for all his careful preparation, had made the fundamental error of trying too hard to appear unremarkable, thereby making himself the most remarkable person in St. Mary Mead. Tomorrow, she felt certain, would bring new developments. The evidence was mounting steadily, but she needed to understand not just what Drake had done, but why he had chosen their peaceful village as the stage for his elaborate deception. Human nature, in all its complexity, would eventually reveal the truth to those patient enough to observe and wise enough to listen. The morning brought with it a development that cast the entire investigation in a new light, though not in the direction Inspector Slack had anticipated. Miss Marple was tending to her roses when Constable Pritchard arrived at her garden gate, his expression bearing the particular satisfaction of someone who believed he had uncovered crucial evidence. "We've had the brook properly dragged, Miss Marple," he announced, consulting his notebook with official precision. "Found the red leather pouch for registered post, caught up in the roots near Miller's Bend. Cut clean along the seam with something sharp, professional-like. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were about." Miss Marple paused in her pruning, noting the constable's choice of words. How very thorough of them, and so conveniently placed where it would certainly be discovered by anyone conducting a proper search. Inspector Slack arrived shortly after, his manner brisk with the confidence of a man whose theories were being vindicated. "Clear evidence of robbery, Miss Marple. The postal pouch was opened, the registered items removed, and the empty bag discarded. We're dealing with someone who knew the value of what they were stealing." Yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by the almost theatrical nature of the evidence. In her experience, genuine criminals rarely left such obvious trails, and the precision of the cut suggested someone with considerable forethought rather than desperate opportunism. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Fletcher, who appeared at the garden gate in a state of considerable agitation, clutching a telegram in her trembling hands. "Miss Marple, something dreadful has happened. I've received this message from my London solicitor." The telegram, in crisp official capitals, acknowledged receipt of a signed delivery receipt for yesterday's registered correspondence and confirmed that final documents would follow by ordinary post. Mrs. Fletcher's voice carried genuine bewilderment as she explained, "But I never signed anything, Miss Marple. Arthur never came to Rose Cottage. I waited by the window until well past 4 o'clock." Miss Marple examined the telegram thoughtfully, noting its precise wording and official appearance. "How very interesting, my dear. Someone has been remarkably thorough in creating the appearance of proper delivery. Did you perhaps receive any visitors yesterday afternoon who might have approached your door?" Mrs. Fletcher's brow furrowed in concentration. "Only the gardener's boy at 2:30, and he left through the side gate as usual. Then, just before 4, I heard the front gate latch, but when I went to investigate, there was no one there, only an ordinary circular had been pushed through the letter slot." The implications of this revelation were not lost on Miss Marple. Someone had not merely stolen Arthur's postal delivery, but had gone to considerable lengths to create false evidence of proper completion. This suggested a level of premeditation that extended far beyond simple theft. Her afternoon visit to the Blue Boar revealed Mr. Drake in the process of settling his account, his luggage already assembled in the lobby with the efficiency of someone accustomed to swift departures. When she inquired politely about his travel plans, his response came with the smooth courtesy that had characterized all their interactions. "Business calls me back to London rather urgently, Miss Marple. These country visits are delightful, but one must attend to practical matters." His smile remained pleasant, though she noticed his hands moved restlessly, adjusting his cufflinks and checking his pocket watch with nervous precision. Mrs. Dollop, ever eager to share local intelligence, mentioned that Mr. Drake had made several telephone calls that morning, speaking in the sort of urgent, quiet tones that suggested important business arrangements. Very particular about the timing he was. Wanted to catch the 4:15 train from Much Benham without fail. The afternoon brought additional testimony that deepened the mystery's complexity. Mrs. Price Ridley, whose sharp ears missed little in the village's daily drama, confided that she had distinctly heard raised voices at Rose Cottage the previous afternoon. A man and woman arguing, Miss Marple. The gentleman had that smooth London manner that always sets one's teeth on edge. I distinctly heard him say, "You'll be sensible, Eleanor, and not make a scene." Colonel Weatherby's confession, when it came, added another layer to the deception. He admitted to Miss Marple that he had burned certain documents in a moment of panic, not the original testimonial he had been expecting from Arthur, but rather copies of old correspondence that might have proven embarrassing if misunderstood. More significantly, he had found a note slipped under his door at dawn, written in an educated hand, suggesting that discretion would be advisable should certain documents fail to arrive as expected. Miss Marple examined the unsigned note, noting its expensive paper and the faint scent of Turkish tobacco that clung to it. The implications were clear. Someone had been systematically manipulating the village's residents, using their private concerns as leverage for a larger deception. As evening approached, she reflected on the day's revelations with growing certainty that Arthur's disappearance was merely one element in a carefully orchestrated scheme. The false telegram, the threatening notes, the convenient discovery of the cut postal pouch all suggested someone with intimate knowledge of both postal procedures and village psychology. Mr. Drake's hasty departure, combined with the physical evidence linking him to the scene of Arthur's disappearance, painted a picture of calculated criminal enterprise disguised as respectable business travel. Yet Miss Marple sensed that even this apparent solution contained layers of deception that had yet to be fully revealed. The blue fabric fragment remained safely preserved in her jewelry box, a tangible reminder that the most important evidence was often the smallest detail, overlooked by those who sought dramatic revelations rather than patient observation. Tomorrow would bring new developments, she felt certain, as the carefully constructed web of lies began to unravel under the weight of its own complexity. In her experience, criminals who believed themselves cleverer than their victims invariably made the fatal error of overconfidence, creating elaborate deceptions when simple ones would have sufficed. The village of St. Mary Mead, with its seemingly placid surface and hidden currents of human nature, had once again become the stage for a drama that would test both justice and the quiet wisdom that came from a lifetime of watching people reveal their true selves when they believed no one was looking. The morning brought with it a development that would prove crucial to unraveling the entire deception, though it arrived in the most unassuming manner possible. Miss Marple was tending to her correspondence when young Timothy Pierce appeared at her garden gate, his face bearing the particular expression of someone who had discovered something important but wasn't entirely certain of its significance. "Miss Marple, I found something yesterday evening that I forgot to mention," he began, with the careful precision that children reserve for matters they sense are serious. "After everyone left the bridge, I went back to look for my fishing float. It was caught under the stone ledge where I sometimes hide things." He produced a small oilskin packet, carefully wrapped and bound with string. Miss Marple accepted it with the gentle attention she always accorded Timothy's discoveries, but her pulse quickened as she recognized the practical nature of the wrapping. Inside lay a narrow notebook, the sort a methodical man might carry for personal record-keeping, and Arthur Finch's neat handwriting filled its pages with delivery times and postal tallies. The final entries, written in Arthur's characteristic careful script, told their own story. Rose Cottage, 3:55. Wayside House, 4:10. Blue Boar, hold. That single word, underlined twice, spoke volumes about Arthur's character and his final decision. He had intended not to complete his delivery to Mr. Drake, a choice that suggested he had seen or suspected something that troubled his conscientious nature. Her next destination was the telephone exchange, where Miss Whitcomb presided over the village's communications with conscientious pride. Under the guise of inquiring about telegram procedures, Miss Marple learned that Mrs. Fletcher's confirmation message had been dictated from the Blue Boar itself, charged to their account, and delivered with unusual urgency for prompt delivery. The caller spoke very fine, like a newsreader, Miss Whitcomb confided. Asked for exact wording to be repeated twice, very particular about the official tone. Said his name was Lang or something similar, though the connection wasn't entirely clear. The implications were immediately clear to Miss Marple. Someone had orchestrated not merely the theft of registered correspondence, but the creation of a false confirmation, suggesting a level of premeditation that extended far beyond simple robbery. The telegram had been crafted to close the loop of deception, making Mrs. Fletcher believe her legal matters had been resolved while concealing the true fate of her crucial documents. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Constable Pritchard, who brought news of a break-in at the post office. The violation had been conducted with surgical precision. A window pane cut cleanly around the putty. Locks slipped from inside, drawers opened and closed with minimal disturbance. Only specific items had been taken, the ledger pages containing yesterday's entries and the duplicate receipt slips for registered post. Miss Marple examined the scene with particular attention to details that others might overlook. On the counter lay a tiny fragment of red sealing wax, crushed into a smear by a careless palm, and the air carried the faint but distinctive scent of Turkish tobacco. The combination confirmed her growing suspicions about the identity of the intruder and his systematic approach to eliminating evidence. Mrs. Rudge, despite her distress, provided additional crucial information. "Only one gentleman in the village asks for Turkish tobacco, regular-like," she observed meaningfully. "Very particular about the blend, he was. Said it helped him think clearly during his business correspondence." The afternoon brought revelations that deepened Miss Marple's understanding of Drake's systematic manipulation of the village's residents. Colonel Weatherby, under gentle questioning, admitted that Drake had approached him privately several days earlier, ostensibly researching military history, but asking suspiciously specific questions about medical supplies and field hospital procedures. Mrs. Fletcher revealed that Drake had visited Rose Cottage, expressing sympathetic interest in her legal difficulties and suggesting that delayed correspondence sometimes worked to one's advantage. Dr. Haydock's inadvertent contribution proved equally illuminating. He mentioned that Drake had consulted him about insomnia, displaying remarkable knowledge of pharmaceutical remedies for someone supposedly in the import business. Very well informed about medical matters, the doctor observed. Asked detailed questions about dosages and effects that suggested professional training rather than casual interest. As the pieces assembled themselves in Miss Marple's mind, the true scope of Drake's deception became clear. He had not simply stolen registered mail, but had orchestrated an elaborate scheme to manipulate multiple villagers simultaneously. Arthur's notebook revealed the moment when the postman's integrity had disrupted these carefully laid plans, leading to whatever fate had befallen him. The blue fabric fragment, still safely preserved in her jewelry box, now represented more than physical evidence of Drake's presence at the scene. It symbolized the way criminals often betrayed themselves through small oversights, details that seemed insignificant until viewed by someone patient enough to observe and wise enough to understand the patterns of human behavior. Evening found Miss Marple in her parlor, her knitting needles moving with methodical rhythm as she considered the day's discoveries. Drake's hasty departure from the Blue Boar, his systematic elimination of evidence, and his manipulation of village psychology all pointed toward someone with considerable skill in deception, but perhaps insufficient understanding of the quiet wisdom that came from a lifetime of observing human nature. The missing Arthur Finch remained the central mystery, but Miss Marple now understood that his disappearance was merely one element in a larger scheme of manipulation and coercion. Tomorrow would bring the opportunity to test her theories and perhaps uncover the full truth about Mr. Drake's real purpose in St. Mary Mead. In her experience, criminals who believed themselves cleverer than their victims invariably made the fatal error of underestimating the power of patient observation and the accumulated wisdom of those who understood that human nature, in all its complexity, eventually revealed itself to those who knew how to look. The village settled into its evening routine, but beneath the peaceful surface, the truth waited to be fully revealed by someone wise enough to trust that every detail, no matter how small, contributed to the larger pattern of deception that would soon be exposed in all its calculated complexity. The morning brought with it a crystalline certainty that Miss Marple had learned to trust after decades of observing human nature in all its complexity. She rose with her customary early hour, but her mind was already arranging the final pieces of a puzzle that had revealed its pattern through patient accumulation of seemingly insignificant details. Arthur's notebook, with its telling final entry of "hold" beside the Blue Boar, had provided the key to understanding not just his disappearance, but the elaborate deception that had been orchestrated around it. Her first destination was the old mill ruins beyond, Miller's Field, following a trail that young Timothy Pierce had mentioned in passing during their conversation about fishing spots. The boy's sharp eyes had noticed disturbed earth and trampled grass leading toward the abandoned structure, details that an adult might have dismissed, but which Miss Marple recognized as potentially crucial evidence. The mill's ancient wheel housing concealed a stone cellar, its entrance hidden beneath carefully arranged brambles that showed signs of recent disturbance. Inside, she discovered Arthur Finch unconscious but breathing steadily, his condition suggesting the careful administration of pharmaceutical sedatives rather than violent assault. Beside him lay his bicycle lamp and postman's cap, along with the missing registered correspondence, each envelope opened with surgical precision and resealed with such skill that casual inspection would never detect the tampering. Dr. Haydock's swift examination confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions about the sophisticated nature of Arthur's incapacitation. Professional-grade sedatives, administered in precise doses to maintain unconsciousness without causing permanent harm, he reported grimly. Whoever did this possessed considerable medical knowledge, far beyond what any casual criminal would understand. The discovery of photographic equipment hidden beneath loose stones revealed the true scope of Drake's operation. He had not simply stolen correspondence, but had created a systematic method for intercepting, copying, and returning official documents while maintaining the appearance of normal postal delivery. The registered letters had been photographed with professional thoroughness, their contents recorded before being carefully resealed and prepared for eventual delivery. Inspector Slack's examination of the evidence painted a picture of criminal enterprise that extended far beyond simple theft. Document copying on this scale suggests industrial espionage or intelligence gathering, he observed, studying the sophisticated equipment. This wasn't opportunistic crime, but a carefully planned operation requiring considerable resources and expertise. As Arthur was transported to Dr. Haydock's surgery for proper medical attention, Miss Marple reflected on the complexity of Drake's deception. His presence at the Blue Boar had provided perfect cover for monitoring the village's postal communications, while his cultivated persona as a gentleman researcher had given him access to residents' private concerns and vulnerabilities. Her afternoon encounter with Drake himself confirmed her understanding of his true nature. She found him in the Blue Boar's lobby, preparing for departure with the calm efficiency of someone who believed his scheme had succeeded perfectly. His luggage stood ready, his appearance impeccable, his manner suggesting a gentleman concluding routine business rather than a criminal fleeing the scene of elaborate deception. "Mr. Drake," she began with her characteristic gentle warmth, "how pleasant to catch you before your departure. I trust your business in our village has concluded satisfactorily." His response came with practiced smoothness, though Miss Marple's trained eye detected subtle signs of tension beneath his polished exterior. "Indeed, Miss Marple, most satisfactory, though I confess myself puzzled by this unfortunate business with the postman. Such irregularities are quite disturbing in a peaceful community." Miss Marple settled into a nearby chair, her knitting needles beginning their rhythmic dance. "Indeed, most disturbing, particularly when one considers how precisely timed the entire affair was. Arthur was so methodical about his routes, you know, almost as if someone had studied his patterns quite carefully." She watched Drake's reaction to this observation, noting the slight tightening around his eyes despite his maintained smile. "One might even say," she continued mildly, "that whoever orchestrated poor Arthur's disappearance possessed remarkable knowledge of postal procedures, timing, and even pharmaceutical matters. Rather like someone conducting research, wouldn't you say?" The mention of pharmaceutical knowledge struck home with visible impact. Drake's composure faltered momentarily, revealing a glimpse of the calculating intelligence that lay beneath his genteel facade. "Research is indeed a complex undertaking, Miss Marple. One must be thorough in gathering information from all available sources." Miss Marple's needles paused in their rhythm. "How true, though I've always found that the most revealing information often comes from the smallest details. A fragment of blue fabric caught on bicycle spokes, for instance, or the particular scent of Turkish tobacco lingering in unexpected places. Such tiny things, yet so illuminating when properly understood." The transformation in Drake's demeanor was immediate and telling. The mask of geniality fell away entirely, replaced by cold calculation and barely controlled menace. His voice, when he spoke again, carried none of its former warmth. "You seem remarkably well informed about details, Miss Marple. One might wonder whether such knowledge could prove inconvenient." Miss Marple met his gaze with serene composure, her gentle exterior concealing the sharp intelligence that had unraveled his elaborate deception. "Knowledge, Mr. Drake, has a way of revealing itself to those patient enough to observe and wise enough to understand what they see. I believe you'll find that your carefully constructed scheme has been rather thoroughly exposed." The church clock chimed the quarter hour, its sound carrying across the village with measured inevitability. Drake's eyes flickered toward the door, calculating distances and possibilities, while Miss Marple sat quietly with her knitting, the embodiment of rural tranquility masking one of the shrewdest minds in St. Mary Mead. The final confrontation was at hand, and both participants, understood that the game of deception had reached its crucial moment. The silence that followed stretched between them with the peculiar quality of a held breath, while Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm. Drake's calculating gaze swept the Blue Boar's lobby, measuring distances and possibilities, though his practiced composure had begun to show hairline cracks beneath her patient scrutiny. "You speak in riddles, Miss Marple," he said finally, his voice stripped of its earlier warmth, though still carefully modulated. "I'm afraid I don't understand these implications about pharmaceutical knowledge and fabric fragments." Miss Marple's smile carried the gentle quality that had disarmed countless individuals over the years. "Oh, I don't think there's anything riddling about it, Mr. Drake. You see, Arthur kept such meticulous records. His notebook, which young Timothy discovered yesterday evening, shows his final entries quite clearly. He had written 'hold' beside your name, hadn't he? Something about your behavior troubled his conscientious nature." The mention of Arthur's notebook produced a visible reaction, though Drake recovered with professional smoothness. "If such a notebook exists, I'm sure it contains nothing more than routine postal notations." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed mildly, her needles clicking with measured precision. "Routine notations that reveal so much about timing and intention. Combined with young Timothy's observations about a gentleman in a blue suit near the bridge, and Mabel's careful attention to the grass stains and sealing wax on your clothing, the picture becomes quite illuminating." She paused to regard him with the sort of gentle attention one might give a particularly interesting specimen. "You didn't simply steal correspondence, did you, Mr. Drake? You established yourself here to intercept it systematically, photographing contents before ensuring proper delivery. Quite sophisticated, requiring considerable medical knowledge to incapacitate Arthur safely, and remarkable skill to reseal official documents without detection." Drake's mask of geniality slipped further as the scope of her understanding became apparent. "Even if such theories were true, you could hardly prove them." "Ah, but proof has a way of accumulating, doesn't it?" Miss Marple observed. "The photographic equipment in the mill cellar, the precisely cut postal pouch, the false telegrams sent from this very establishment, all pointing to someone with professional training in document interception." The sound of approaching footsteps caused both to turn. Inspector Slack appeared in the doorway, accompanied by Constable Pritchard and 2 additional officers. Their presence transformed the intimate confrontation into official business, though Miss Marple continued her knitting with unruffled calm. "Mr. Lionel Drake," Inspector Slack announced with evident satisfaction, "I'm arresting you in connection with the kidnapping of Arthur Finch and theft of registered mail." Drake's final attempt at maintaining his facade crumbled as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "This is preposterous. Miss Marple's accusations are nothing more than village gossip and speculation." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with mild interest. "Oh, I think the evidence speaks quite clearly. The blue fabric fragment from your suit, the Turkish tobacco residue at the post office break-in, the photographic equipment bearing your fingerprints, and of course, Arthur's notebook documenting his growing suspicions about your behavior." As Drake was led away, his carefully constructed persona dissolved entirely, revealing the cold intelligence of someone who had orchestrated elaborate deceptions across multiple locations. His parting glance carried the bitter frustration of superior planning undone by patient village observation. The afternoon brought revelations about the true scope of Drake's operation. The photographic equipment revealed evidence of document interception spanning several counties, suggesting a sophisticated network dedicated to industrial espionage. Mrs. Fletcher's legal correspondence had been merely one target among many, chosen for its potential value to interested parties in London. Arthur Finch's recovery proceeded smoothly under Dr. Haydock's care, his memories returning gradually as the sedatives cleared from his system. His account confirmed Miss Marple's reconstruction. Drake had approached him on the bridge with friendly conversation, then administered the sedative through a seemingly innocent offer of refreshment. "I should have been more suspicious," Arthur confided to Miss Marple during his convalescence. But he seemed such a gentleman, so interested in postal history and village life. Miss Marple adjusted his pillow with maternal care. The most dangerous criminals, Arthur, are often those who appear most respectable. They understand that the best hiding place is in plain sight among people who would never suspect their true nature. Mrs. Fletcher's relief at learning her legal documents had been recovered intact was palpable, though the knowledge that her private affairs had been photographed left her shaken. Colonel Weatherby, freed from his fears about old military correspondence, resumed his daily routines with military precision, though with newfound appreciation for village security. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, the parish tea resumed its monthly schedule, cucumber sandwiches and quiet gossip flowing with familiar comfort. Yet beneath the surface, tranquility lay a new understanding of how easily peaceful communities could become targets for those who mistook rural simplicity for naivete. Miss Marple sat in her garden as twilight gathered, her knitting needles moving with characteristic rhythm while she reflected on the case's resolution. The blue fabric fragment, now safely stored as evidence, had proven once again that the smallest details often held keys to the largest mysteries. Human nature, in all its complexity, continued to fascinate those patient enough to observe its endless variations. The postman's punctual arrival at 4 o'clock would resume tomorrow, carrying with it the comfortable certainties that made village life both precious and enduring. In St. Mary Mead, order had been restored, though the memory of disruption would linger as a reminder that even the most peaceful places harbored depths that could surprise those who looked carefully enough to see beneath the surface of respectability to the calculating minds that sometimes lurked there.